Okay, welcome back to Rev 9 video. This will be a new series. We talked about, we did the intro video, and we did the Jews versus Gentiles, which I figured was the most important thing to do because you really need to see and understand that the 12 tribes are these people prophesied in the New Testament that fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament, and how the Old Testament and the New Testament are all one story. They're not two disconnected stories, which is should make sense because the New Testament, as I mentioned before, it quotes the Old Testament 205 times. So there's 300 total quotes. 95 of those are duplicated in other verses, and we're going to see that. So this is a PDF. You can go to my website and just download that. And then we have the opposite of this, which we're going to look at. This is your quotes in the New Testament, starting in Matthew 1:23, in order. And then if you have the other one, I've done the reverse order. So the first quote in the Old Testament is Genesis 2:2, and that's in Hebrews 4:4. So then after we do the New Testament, we'll go back and do all this in the reverse order, because it kind of teaches a different storyline in a sense when you do it in this order versus the other. So you don't really notice that all this stuff is in the New Testament because it's all spread through the, all through these books. And as you're reading through, most people, when I tell them there's 205 quotes, they're like, wow, you just don't realize that there's that many quotes. So I've laid all this out, and you notice that a lot of these, what's good about this is if you're in Matthew 19:5, for example, it's nice to know when you go back here and look at Genesis 2:24 that that's also quoted in Ephesians and in 1 Corinthians, the same verse. So it's nice to know that, because now you just connected the dots between whatever you're reading in Matthew 19:5 to Ephesians. So you can flip over there and see the context, and now you realize that the context of Matthew, Ephesians, and 1 Corinthians, that those three are all the same thing because they go to the same verse. Now sometimes you'll have different quotes that go to the same verse, but when you're looking at in the New Testament, they appear to actually say different things. So you almost wouldn't notice that they're supposedly should be the exact same context, let's say, because they kind of might use the quote as a little bit different meaning when they're teaching. So it's nice to recognize that. And the other thing you notice from looking through here is that some of these, like here's 1, 20, 12, gee, look how many different things in the New Testament all quote the same verse here in Exodus 20:12, which is about the law, in other words. Law of Moses, we call it. It's really the law of Abraham. I already showed you that Abraham was following God's law. He set up a justice system based on God's laws back in Genesis. So all Moses is doing is writing down the law that Abraham had already given to the 12 tribes. But I realize people don't seem to know that. But there's going to be a lot of good things from looking through this. One of your big teachings is about the stumbling stone. It's amazing that you talk to people and don't realize that the stumbling stone is such a big thing in the New Testament. I've talked to people who've been in church all their life. They've heard of the stumbling stone, but they don't realize it's the biggest, as far as cross-references go. Christ the stumbling stone, which is right here, it's the biggest teaching in the New Testament. There's more cross-references that go to Christ the stumbling stone than anything. Because not only is it in Psalms, it's over in Isaiah, it's actually in multiple books. So it's amazing. And it's in Isaiah in different places. For example, you see here, 8:14, Christ the stumbling stone. You look down here, 28:16, you've got Christ the stumbling stone. So it's in different places in Isaiah. Same thing in other places. You have over, I don't know, I didn't count them all. There's probably 20 verses quoted in the New Testament about Christ the stumbling stone. So it's quite amazing. Now we're actually going to start, let's just go down here and leave it sitting on Micah, because that's the first thing we're going to come to over here. Well, we're going to come to Isaiah 7:14. First verse will be Isaiah 7:14 about Emmanuel, and then we'll come back over here to Micah. So let's just leave it on Micah. As you can see, there was only one quoted verse about Emmanuel. And I made some notes because some of these are important. So there's Micah 5:2, and you can see Matthew 2:6 is the only one that quotes that. So let's switch back. We'll start with Matthew 1:23. So what we're going to do, I'll kind of put these in context up here. And you notice I mentioned 12 tribes redeemed by Christ on the second one, and Micah in the end time. So people ask, well, you know, they don't, never heard that Micah, there was any end time context to Micah, and they don't, they just don't get all this stuff, and because they've never been taught it. But I'm going to show you, and you should also have, and I've gone ahead and pulled it up in my pictures. Now, here's my charts. This is New Testament in context 1, so this is the very first verse of the New Testament, Matthew 1:1, about Christ the son of Abraham. And I've shown you, this is the only one where I kind of showed how all these cross-references connect. Now it starts out Christ the son of David, the son of Abraham. So, but it's Christ the son of Abraham. And if you look at your cross-references, not every cross-reference Bible is identical. Here's the other thing. You can take 5 cross-reference Bibles, lay them side by side, and they all go to different cross-references. They don't all cross-reference exactly the same. If they did, there'd be no reason to have different ones, I guess. But, you know, some people, there's a good reason for being able to go to different cross-references in your Bible, because the way things cross-reference, you know, they don't necessarily go back to your source verse. I try to think about source verses as going back to things that are in the Old Testament as far back as you can go. Like we know Genesis 49:10 is, I've mentioned multiple times, is the most used cross-reference in the New Testament. Genesis 49:10 is Christ the scepter. Now if you just scroll down, you'll see Christ the shield, the stone, and the scepter. So we'll get down there. But Christ the scepter is the King of Judah, Lion of Judah. Everybody knows Christ the Lion of Judah. Well, that's where that comes from. That's a prophecy that we have. It was a prophecy of Jacob to the 12 tribes, in other words. If you go back to that section in 49, he's giving prophecies or blessings, it says, to each of his sons. And the one for Judah is where we figure Christ, the beginnings of the teaching of Christ come from. But actually it comes from Christ the shield back in Genesis 15:1. So we're going to kind of make that point as we go along. So you should have these charts already printed out in 11 by 17 or 12 by 18, if you can print them in that size. Because we're going to refer to all this. I've already got all these cross-references on these charts for you. So looking these cross-references up would take you years, which is what I've been doing, spending the last 7 years looking through these cross-references. And what I've done, just to make the point, I've looked up all the quotes, all the cross-references in the New Testament, which has taken me about 7 years to do. So if you wanted to do this and try to learn and see how things all interconnect, and you want to spend 7 years doing it, that's about how long it took me, and I've spent at least 1,000 hours a year doing it. So yes, it takes a long time, because you don't just look at one cross-reference, you have to go down the line, which you can see on the charts, how all the cross-references connect, verse by verse by verse, and book to book to book, and then in between books, and how all that connects. The rock was Christ. That's a very good one to look at, so you can see all those connect to each other. So you can see when you're looking at cross references in the New Testament or the Old Testament, they go to multiple verses, which is why all your cross-reference Bibles can be slightly different. Do you want to go to the verse in Matthew? Do you want to go to the verse in Mark? Or do you want to cross-reference to the one in Luke? Because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all can maybe all say the same thing. So, yes, which one do you connect to? So, sometimes, for example, John might mention the same thing. The one in John is a little more specific. Maybe the cross-reference would look better to go to John and see what John said about a certain concept. So that's why each one's slightly different. So, and I inserted Genesis 15:1 into this because Genesis 15:1 comes from the study on the rock was Christ, and then that cross-reference comes from I think it's 2 Samuel 22:2 or something like that, which you can look at on the chart. So you got to look up all these charts, and we're just going to start here, and then I'm going to refer to these charts. You can look at them. They're JPEGs, so you can download them on your computer and just kind of look at them that way, but you got to blow them up to do it. So it's not the easiest and the quickest way to do it is really just have them printed out on pieces of paper where you can flip through them. There's more than 30 charts now. And the charts are, they're shot in high def, but they're the top of the chart and the bottom. So each chart has a top and a bottom that kind of overlap slightly. Excuse me. So you need to have them printed top and bottom so you can lay them there and read them. It's the only good way of doing it. At any rate, we'll do the same thing. We'll try to keep the videos down to about 40 minutes, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to name them just yet, but probably all prophecies according to Christ, or in order or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to do it, but we'll just start here and go with that. So your first quote, Isaiah 7:14, and that's also, Emmanuel's also mentioned over in 8:8. If you look at it, it's probably your chapter heading if you're reading it, and that means God with us. Now the important thing to note is that when you looked at 7:14 up, you'll notice that Isaiah is just kind of in the middle of a conversation here with King Ahaz, which starts at the beginning of chapter 7, and he's saying some different things, and I guess he's kind of telling him about some prophetic events in a sense, and then he gets to 7:14, and just out of the blue, it's like, he says, look, that virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name God with us, which is Emmanuel. He will eat butter and honey when he learns how to distinguish between bad and good. And if you read that, you're looking at that and like, how does that fit in the context of what Isaiah is saying to King Ahaz? Well, that's the whole point. It doesn't. It's like, and I'm sure Isaiah, he couldn't have possibly not even known what he was saying there. He just, obviously through the Spirit of God, he's talking to the king, and he just mentions that. Talks about Emmanuel, he couldn't possibly know anything about it. So it's just through the Spirit. It doesn't fit in with the context. And if you read the rest of it, well, how do you figure out, the context of that and fit it in with what he's trying to say there, even in chapter 7. So I don't know, but if you keep reading through chapter 8 and all that, this is really, and I teach it as an end time context, and we'll see that because if you go back over to my other chart, and here's what the other chart's for. You go back over, I guess we should have just done that first, Isaiah. Go back to Isaiah. Okay, and you notice there's 7:14, but here's other things in Isaiah being taught for the beginning. So you should look back over here if you want to know what the context of Isaiah is. Look at how many quotes from the New Testament we have in Isaiah. Look at that. All the way up to 66:14. All those quotes. The whole book of Isaiah is actually quoted in the New Testament, starting with chapter 1, verse 9. And generally, you know, you got to look before and after when you go look these quotes up, so you can get your context of what it's talking about. And when you get to 6:9, you're going to kind of see, you notice my note there, that's Jews. And look up the acronyms also at the bottom of the chart, so you know what all these acronyms are. That's Jews against Christ versus Jews for Christ. That's really from 1:9 up to chapter 6, 9, and 10. That is the context of what you read between chapter 1 and chapter 7. That's the context. It's all talking about the people of Israel who were rejected or revolted from Christ, which fits the context of Christ the stumbling stone, which we'll get to in 8:14. So right there, this whole first of Isaiah is really about Christ the stumbling stone. So this first verse, 7:14, is Christ being born as Emmanuel. One more chapter later, it's Christ the stumbling stone, and the first 7 chapters, the first 6 chapters, are all about Jews against Christ versus Jews for Christ, and the fact that the Jews against Christ were the ones that stumbled over the message of Christ. So the whole first 8 chapters, if you want to look at it that way, are all in the same context. They're all about these Jews against Christ stumbling over this message of Christ, but you wouldn't see that necessarily unless you noticed what all connects back here to Isaiah and went through and read all that and put all that into context before you read Isaiah 7:14. Then you'd see that, well, Isaiah 7:14 is really kind of, that's a good spot to put that, because you got Christ the stumbling stone in the next chapter, and all this stuff before is all about these members of the 12 tribes, which are generally the leadership, like I said, the leadership, the teachers, the nobles, the priests, and so forth, and the Pharisees and the scribes, and all these people who are rejecting this idea of Christ, or that Christ was the Messiah. They're waiting on the Messiah. They know about the Messiah, but they're rejecting the idea that Christ is the Messiah. The reason they're rejecting Christ as the Messiah is all you have to do is just go back to the beginning of Isaiah and start with that up to 7:14, and you'll see why they rejected Christ the Messiah. It's right there in the first 6 chapters of Isaiah. You can see why they rejected the Messiah. Because all these prophecies back here in these first 6 chapters, that's what they're expecting Christ to fulfill when he's there walking among them, and realize that they knew who he was, they knew his family, they knew his brothers and sisters and all that kind of thing. So they knew who he was. So they're thinking, well, this guy couldn't possibly be the Messiah here, and we don't know where he learned all this stuff and about this message in these scrolls, since they're here in the synagogue, in other words, and you know, when has he been in here and studied all this stuff and all that kind of thing. So they see he heals people, and they say, well, yeah, okay, but God does that. Christ doesn't do it. That's the way you know, they're looking at, well, okay, he's standing here among us. He's not the one that's actually healing. You know, God's doing the healing, and I agree with that thought. So they're thinking, okay, so God, he's calling on God, and God's healing these people at his command. Okay, well, that's fine, but that doesn't make him the Messiah. If he's the Messiah, he's got to fulfill these prophecies in Isaiah. That's the whole point. And there, right there at the beginning of Isaiah, had you gone back here and started with 1:9, or the first chapter, in other words, put it in context, all the way up to chapter 6:9, then 9 and 10, then when you saw these quotes, Matthew, Luke, John, and Acts, and looked these verses up and came back here to Isaiah 6:9, then you would get this context of Jews against Christ versus Jews for Christ, if you just read the first part of it. So using this chart is very handy. Now we're going to go back through the Bible, we're going to go through all the book of Isaiah and all these other prophets in order, just like this. And while we're doing that, I'm going to put in some of the key cross-references, because there's things that are not quoted in the New Testament, curiously. For example, like Ezekiel 37. Everybody knows Ezekiel 37 about the dry bones, and then right after the dry bones, well, you've got the, you know, you've got all 12 tribes being brought back together under Christ, which is your common prophecy about Christ, which is what they were expecting. That was the sign, or one of the signs, that they were expecting Christ to fulfill as the Messiah. He wasn't doing that, and he didn't explain to them why he wasn't doing that. So that was the confusion. That's why they rejected him, which can clearly be seen if we just go back through all these prophecies, which is what we're going to be doing. So I'm just trying to give you an understanding of why I did this in this order. Now you can see how all these things interconnect. And these are just quotes. Now, if we did the same thing with cross-references, I'm going to have to insert some cross-references because there's some key things that, like I said, Ezekiel 37, there's others that are not mentioned, and we're going to see some here real quick that are not mentioned, and you're like, wow, that's kind of important, so we got to cover that. So when we go back and start at the beginning of Genesis, we'll put in some of these key things that are not actually mentioned as cross-references. However, if you're reading the New Testament, if you were looking up your cross-references, everything we're going to teach is actually in the New Testament. But it's there in a cross-reference, not in a quote. That's the issue. So if you're not looking up your cross-references, you don't realize the whole Old Testament is all, would be quoted. It would be quoted if it was written that way. Just these cross-references, a lot of these cross-references in the New Testament could be quotes. If the New Testament was just written that way and actually used what it's talking about and made it a quote instead of just referring to it, which kind of expects us to know what it's talking about. So it's very handy that we have all these cross-references. In fact, we would most of that stuff that's cross-referenced in the New Testament could actually be quoted verses. It could be written that way. It's just not. At any rate, the information's there, you just don't realize it because no one teaches the New Testament through cross-references and quotes. We're going to do it that way, and I guess no one's ever done it that way before. And then we're going to kind of connect the dots here. So our point here was that, hey, that's just stuck in there, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But, like I said, if you go over to 8.8 and see what's over on 8.8, that's kind of an interesting one. Mine is a chapter heading Song of Triumph for Emmanuel. I don't know what it says. Mine just says, for God is with us, which is Emmanuel. The other thing about this is, this 8.8, this is actually about the second coming of Christ. And then, of course, if you look down, it's about the stumbling block, which is, I've got there 8:14, 1 Peter 2:8. Okay, so if you scroll down, you see Christ, the stumbling block. And then if you go on down, this whole section is really about the second coming of Christ, but I can't get into that at this moment. Not until we kind of go back and put this stuff in order. If you don't see the order, I can't show you that it's, you know, in time if you don't see the whole context. So let's go to the second one. So we'll just switch back over. The second one is Matthew 2:6 about Micah 5:2. Christ is to come from Bethlehem. So that's a prophecy. First of all, Mary shall conceive Emmanuel. That's a prophecy. So what Isaiah said, and I'm going to kind of point out that most all these quotes are prophecies, almost every one. So Mary shall conceive Emmanuel, that's a prophecy. It's a prophecy that Isaiah gave. Okay? Christ is to come from Bethlehem, that's a prophecy. It's a prophecy from Micah. Here's going to be an interesting thing about this prophecy. Okay? Micah 5:2. Let's go over to Micah 5:2, and what do we see? Now, yeah, I said each Bible reads a little different. But you, pretty Bethlehem, those small in the thousands of Judah, from you comes to me the great ruler of Israel, who brought you long ago in old times from the east. So he fixes the time for the birth of her child. He will restore with the children of Israel the rest of his brothers. He shall stand and control in the strength of the Lord and the power of the name of Jehovah the God, and they rest when tired at the bounds of the earth. Okay? That's actually about the second coming of Christ. It's about the 12 tribes redeemed by Christ in the end time. So, now, this is about Christ coming from Bethlehem. Let's make a point. From you comes to me the great ruler of Israel. Okay. So Christ is the great ruler of Israel, who brought you long ago in old times from the east. So he's really talking about Christ bringing out the 12 tribes from Egypt, in a sense, up to the promised land. That's what he's talking about. Brought them out of Egypt into the promised land in the old times. Okay. And he says from the east. The reason for that is because this is really, okay, I wrote on here 12 times redeemed by Christ. So this is really because we're reading this, we're in the West, okay? Today, the Christian people, these Jews for Christ, well, where are the Jews for Christ? Like I said, they're in the United States and they're in the UK, the great Christian nation and the commonwealth of Christian nations prophesied by Joseph in Genesis. That's where we're reading it from. And so, brought us out in the old times from the east. Well, the east for us is Egypt, of course, so they're in our east. That's the real context of what it is. Now, let's look at some other things here. I said it's end time context. Well, you know, let's just go back and look at the rest of Micah. Oh, now, first of all, Micah. Let's go to our other chart. Let's go down to Micah. Not much in Micah. 5:2 and 6:15 from John. Let's just go back and look at Micah. Starts right out talking about the first verse, Samaria and Jerusalem. So Samaria and Jerusalem, that's technically all 12 tribes, if you think about it. Come listen, all peoples, the earth and her products attend. So he's basically saying, let's all 12 tribes listen to this message. In other words, the mighty Lord comes against you. The Lord starts from his holy abode. So in other words, the house of God. Judgment starts at the house of God. So this was on my chart in Revelation, because this is mentioned 3 times, I think. The judgment at the end time starts at the house of God. For look, the Lord comes from his home, descends and proceeds on the heights of the earth, and beneath him the hills are dissolved, and the plains are like wax before fire, and water poured down from a steep. So, that's what Revelation teaches about how the same thing you'll see in Isaiah when you're looking in Isaiah about the end time quotes, what's going to happen in the end time. Same thing, hills are dissolved like wax. It's also in Revelation. And then when you're in Revelation cross-references back to these things in Isaiah. So the context is the same. Roll down. Verse 5. All this is for Jacob's revolt and Israel's house that has sinned. What is Jacob's sin? Samaria. And what is Judah's revolt? Jerusalem. So what he's talking about is all 12 tribes. First you had the house of Israel that were divorced. They went into captivity into Assyria. And then later the Jerusalem, the house of Judah, went into captivity in Babylon. So really all 12 tribes sinned, revolted, or some of them did. You remember, a remnant was left behind. We mentioned that in the last videos. 10% that was mentioned in Amos, and somewhere else we were looking at twice, it mentioned that there's 10% of the people basically that followed his law and kept with the message of Christ and that kind of thing. Alright, so, and you can just read through this, continue on. But here's something interesting. 1:15, but yet I will bring you an heir, proud lady, to govern you right, shave and shear for the children you loved, like a bald eagle, make yourself bald, for from you they are carried away. Okay, well, this heir, actually, that it's talking about here in the first chapter is Christ, Emmanuel, right? Christ, who would come from Bethlehem over here in chapter 5, is the heir that's mentioning right here in chapter 1, verse 15. I'll bring you an heir. Well, who's the heir that's to come? The heir, let's just look at our chart, because the heir is Christ. Remember, Christ the son of Abraham. Very first verse in the New Testament. Christ the son of David, Christ the son of Abraham. That's what it is. It is Christ the son of Abraham, not David the son of Abraham, as some people would assume. It's Christ the son of Abraham. If you look at, and there's people that debate this, because you don't have a quote, in other words, and you don't have a cross-reference that goes back to Genesis, however I found it, but Galatians 3:16 is most likely, and there might be multiple cross-references. It might go to Hebrews, and if you just look over, it might go to Galatians 3:16 and Hebrews 2:16, or it might go back to Genesis 22:18, 26:4, or 28:14. All those references there, cross-references, it could go to, depending on which cross-reference Bible you have on your hand at the moment. So if you take your neighbor's cross-reference Bible and look at his, if his is different, you'll find maybe a different couple of cross-references in his than what yours has. But everybody typically knows that Galatians 3:16 is Paul talking about this seed of Abraham, which is Christ the heir. This is a big contention with some people, that Christ is the heir of Abraham and not Isaac. So, in other words, when you're back at Genesis 15, it looks like, well, the heir that's talking about back there is Isaac, but it is talking about Isaac as an heir, because Abraham's arguing he's actually talking with Christ, and he's saying, well, Melchizedek, whatever you want to look at it. He's talking with Christ as shield, in fact. Genesis 15:1. That's who he's talking about. I am your shield and your exceeding great reward. That's Christ speaking to Abraham. That's who Abraham's talking to in Genesis 15:1. And that is Melchizedek from the chapter before. That's who he's talking about. The heir was promised. Now we're going to see that before we get out of Micah. I just want to make this point because we're going to wrap with this in Micah. And you're going to see it's right here. So, first of all, you've got the heir here in 1:15. I'll send you an heir. And we know that's Christ, because if you read on, there's nothing there good, but here, let's go on up to, we're still in Micah, chapter 2. Let's go up to about verse 12. I will gather the whole of you, Jacob, in other words, all 12 tribes. I will join Israel's fragments, think remnant. So the remnant of the 12 tribes will collect as sheep, or in Basra. So in other words, he'll collect the 12 tribes as sheep. Think about the remnant, the Jews for Christ, who kept to his word, followed his law, and taught the message of Christ all the way to the end, which is exactly what I've pointed out in Revelation multiple times. 12:17, these 12 stars were the 12 tribes. The woman was Sarah. And it tells you in 12:17 that her children would continue to follow God's law and teach the message of Christ. That's the remnant. That's the concept of the remnant. It's also in 14:12 about the 12, and of course chapter 14 is the 12 tribes. It starts out that way in chapter 14. They're the 144,000, 144,000 from verse 7 in Revelation are the 12 tribes. So, chapter 14 of Revelation starts out about the 12 tribes, twice redeemed. First redemption was when Christ came the first time. The second redeemed is when Christ is coming the second time, redeeming them basically right then as victors over the beast, which is how Revelation 15 starts out. So they're servants, they're conquerors, they're victors over the beast, they're redeemed, all right there in chapter 14 of Revelation. That's redeemed. First coming, second coming. Here they are, all 12 tribes gathered together into one as sheep. The opener shall go up before them unloosed, and they shall pass through the gate. They shall pass with their leader before them. The leader is Christ, and the Lord at their head. Right? So that's Micah chapter 2, very end of chapter 2. There you go, all 12 tribes. So think Hebrews 8:8. That's the context of Hebrews 8:8, right there. And we know it's about the 12 tribes because chapter 3, I cry, listen now, chiefs of Jacob, and you rulers of Israel's house, or the house of Israel. Why have you no knowledge or judgment, hating the good but in love with the bad? So it's talking about Jews against Christ of all 12 tribes, Jacob and Israel. He just told you. Now, then he's talking about here in the rest of this is about war. You tear their skin from them and flesh from their bones. You devour the flesh of my people. Devouring the flesh of his people in war, perpetual war, getting them involved in all these world wars, or continuous war, perpetual war, so they can make money. Stripping their skin, crushing their bones, chop up as they do for the pot, and like flesh to be mixed in a stew. When such cry to the Lord, he will never reply. The people he won't reply to are the Jews against Christ. So here are your warmongers. But then hide his presence from them when their wickedness comes on themselves. So that's the Jews against Christ, anyone that fits within that category except the remnant. So anybody who supports these warmongers, who elects warmongers to office instead of electing Christian people over them, which is what Exodus chapter 18 clearly tells you. And I've got a whole book on how you set up a government based on God's law. All those verses are right there in the Old Testament. Clearly tells you how to maintain a government under God's law, which started with Abraham, his household. He set up a judgment system based on God's law in Abraham's household. And you read about that kind of starting in chapter 14 of Genesis, where he took these 316 men of his household, trained in bows and arrows or whatever, swords and so forth, that Abraham trained them to fight, and they went out and rescued Lot. That was the beginning of it, or at least the first mention of it. Alright, so we're still in chapter 3 of Micah. Scroll down, verse 5. Thus says the Lord to the preachers who swindle my people by gnashing their teeth and cry peace, and make ready to fight those who fill not their mouths. So he's talking about the hirelings. You shall have night and darkness, the sun shall go down on such prophets, blackness spread over their day. They shall be ashamed, they shall blush, blah, 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 for they have no message from God. Verse 7. Yeah. So, I'm full of the Spirit, power of the Lord, judgment, strength to tell Jacob his sin, and to Israel tell of his crimes. So he's not talking about anybody but the 12 tribes. Chiefs of Jacob's house, listen to this. Verse 9. And the guides who hate justice in the house of Israel, the oppressors of all who do right, who build Zion with blood and Jerusalem vice. So here, they run all the criminal organizations. Not only the military, but, think prostitution and everything else you can do for crime. Whose judges decree for a bribe. So bribery for justice so they can stay out of jail. That's exactly what you have right now and have had in your government for the last 100 years. People who are so powerful that no matter what crimes they commit, they never seem to go to jail for them or pay for them, whose priests only teach for their pay, whose prophets for money divine. So here you go. When we wrap this up, you're going to see that these preachers that you're going to in churches are not teaching you just the simplest Christianity 101. Who lean on Jehovah and say, the Lord, is he not in our midst? No suffering can come upon us. Yes. Yet Zion for you will be plowed like a field, and Jerusalem turned like the clods, and the hill of this house be knoll in the wood. Yeah, so what he's saying is you're going to be destroyed in war. Judgment starts from the house of God. That's how it started out. So that was 3:12. Let's go to chapter 14. But when will all this happen? But it shall be at the end of the times. The hill of the house of the Lord shall be fixed as the chief of the hills, and higher shall be than the heights, and to it all people shall flow. Okay, in time, but it says it again. It'll say it again. It's talking about New Jerusalem. He'll be the chief of New Jerusalem. The hill of the house of the Lord is New Jerusalem. At the end of Revelation there. And all these peoples flow. Think the end of Zechariah 14, where it tells you all the other heathen people will come up and seize the hand of one of the 12 tribes to go up to New Jerusalem, because they have to go up for the Feast of Tabernacles. That's why they're going to flow there, besides other reasons. Many nations advance and exclaim, let us go to the hill of the Lord, to the temple where Jacob's God dwells. That's New Jerusalem. Learn of his way and pursue. In other words, pursue how to do things righteously. For from Zion the law shall proceed, and the Lord from Jerusalem speak. Yes, all the law will be decided from New Jerusalem and these 12 tribes, these priests of the kingdom of God, the royal priesthood. That's what all your prophecies reiterate. The Lord from Jerusalem speak. That'll be New Jerusalem. See, it just says Jerusalem here, but you got to understand, it just told you. He's talking about New Jerusalem. Govern among many peoples, decree to fierce nations afar to beat out their swords into plowshares, and their spears. For nation shall not rise against nation, nor ever more learn to make war. Well, we're making quite a bit of war right now, so this is a future prophecy. It hasn't happened in the past, it's a future prophecy. End time, New Jerusalem, so on. And the law comes from New Jerusalem with the royal priesthood, who's the one that's going to govern people with an iron rod. Is exactly what it says 3 times just in Revelation. Okay? Then each shall rest under his vine and under his fig without fear. It's actually talking about family trees. Your family tree, the vine, the fig tree, that kind of thing. It's a family tree. As the mouth of the Lord has decreed, which he just said, no more war, no more contention between people. For then all peoples will walk, each one in the power of its God, and we shall also walk with the power of the Lord forever and ever. Okay, again, end time, future. Verse 6, this is chapter 4, verse 6. At that time, I will gather the maimed, cherish the mourner, I grieved, and make the disabled a princedom, and the banished a powerful nation, and the Lord reign with them on Mount Zion from then and forever and ever. Okay. And you, tower of the flock, you fair maiden of Zion. All right, so princes of kingdoms, Jerusalem's daughter. Of course, he's talking about the 12 tribes redeemed right there at that time. Okay, now if you're scrolling down, verse 10, go onward to Babel until I release. So, people read this and think, okay, this is about the Babylonian captivity. What this is prophecy, the end time within prophecy, historical prophecy. Some of this is actually dual prophecy. We can't, it's kind of hard to, until after the fact, to separate out and say, okay, it was a dual prophecy. Generally, and we're going to see this multiple times in these prophecies, they're prophecies within prophecies. So some of what you're reading may actually have happened in Babylon, blah, blah, blah. But other parts are clearly end time, and they will have an end time context. It's a prophecy within another prophecy. In other words, a future prophecy within a historical prophecy, whatever. Just like the prophecies in Isaiah about Christ were prophecies of the first coming of Christ and prophecies of the second coming of Christ, all within the same prophecies. But part of it was about when Christ came the first time, part of it was about Christ coming the second time. When you read it, you had no way to know. There's no way to know when you're reading Isaiah about the prophecies that apply to Christ about the first and the second coming. There's no way to separate the facts that, oh, this is first coming, that's second coming. From their perspective, it was impossible. You can only do it when you're looking back at this point in time and say, okay, well, this is about the first coming, this is about the second coming. It's only possible looking back. It's not possible to look at this from their viewpoint and say, oh, okay, so this is later. No, if they were reading this, they would say, okay, well, they clearly see this is New Jerusalem, and this is Christ, this is our Messiah, there's not going to be any more war, he's going to redeem us. All right, well, when are you going to do that? You're walking here, talking to us right now. In other words, I'm saying this is, when Christ was walking here on earth. So the Pharisees are saying, they're looking at this and say, okay, well, what about this? What about this? You're going to put us in control. Okay. We're going to be with you forever, just like it says. It says it twice. At that time. Well, when is that time? You're here. What's the sense? From their perspective, what's the sense of Christ coming twice? There is no sense. He's there. So as far as they're saying, well, let's do it right now. You see? Of course they rejected him. And if any of us had been standing there at the same time, they would be saying, well, you're here. Let's do it. We've been waiting all these years. We've been in captivity. Now look, we got the Romans over us and the Edomites. We got Herod running our country. You're standing here. What's the problem? Do you understand? That's why they rejected Christ. He was there. They were waiting. Waiting to be redeemed. And no. He had to be killed. He had to die because he had, and it explains that in the New Testament, to be the inheritor, he had to first die, So in other words, for you to inherit from your father's things, he has to die first. You typically don't inherit while your father's still alive. I mean, that's the idea of inheritance, let's put it that way. That's what he said in the New Testament. I forget where that is, but, that's the whole point. They didn't realize that, oh, okay, he has to die, so they don't get that. So let's just go on. Okay. First, we're still in 4, verse 14, you can strike Israel's prince with a rod on the cheek. So that's about Christ. Okay. You can, oh, okay, well, now you can rob me, you child of a robber, blah, blah, blah. So if you just read that up, at any rate, that's kind of about Christ being struck, because in the next verse we get to chapter 5, and then that's Christ, of course, in 5:2, which Micah 5:2, which was the quote that we were looking at. And then there he says he'll restore the children of Israel. So again, they're thinking, okay, if you're going to restore us and the rest of our brothers, so you're going to restore all 12 tribes, it looks like, well, that's the same context as verse 4. And then if you just go on. So we're in 5. Let's go on 4. He will bring us deliverance from Asher, will come to our land, will walk on our hills. Okay, so they're saying, all right, well, if this is you, you're here, and appoint 7 shepherds above us. Well, there's the 7 churches in Revelation. So you're going to appoint 7 shepherds above us. Well, when are you going to do that? You see? Break with the sword Asher's land, and the gates of the land of Nimrod, and will rescue from Asher those brought from our country, whom he took out from our bounds. But the fragments of Jacob, that's verse 6, shall be in great nations. Yes, So here's your house of Israel scattered all throughout great nations. Like dew from the Lord, rain on the grass, not contrived by man's mind. Thus the fragments of Jacob shall be to the heathen in the midst of great peoples, a lion with cows in the forest. Yes, tiger to the sheepfold. So even though the house of Israel was scattered into all these other nations, spread out, and they went all across Europe and all that, still the ones who called on Christ, followed his law, had Christ, the rock, Christ, the shield, fighting for them. But you had to stick with that. You had to follow his law. You had to set up a justice system based on his law wherever you went, regardless of the fact that you were being, spread throughout all these nations and chased and some of them killed, which is what he said he would do, send a sword after you. So, yes, he killed off the ones who just don't get it. Kept the ones that kept with the message of Christ, doing the right things, maintaining justice, and doing having judges that can't be bribed and all that kind of thing. So, same context of what we just read through, and you can read through that. But verse 9, but at that time I will cut off your chariot drivers, cut off the town of your land, throw down your fortifications, cut witchcraft off from your hands. You shall have no more diviners. In other words, people who read your palm, think of it that way, and tell your horoscope. Cut from you statues and idols. Yes, things that people put ahead of God. In other words, their riches, their boats, and their cars, and their airplanes, and their mansions, and all that. You shall no more serve the work of your hands, but abolish your shrines when I have destroyed your assailants and execute. My throat is just so dry. I have a hard time speaking. Execute justice and anger and wrath on the heathen who would never hear. Okay, the heathen who would never hear were the ones, Jews against Christ. So the other people just take advantage of the things they have, but it's his people. We know he's talking about his people because, just continue on, that was 5:14. Go to chapter 6. Hear now what the Lord has required. Arise, plead to the mountains. Let the hills hear your voice. Hear, mountains, the plea of the Lord. And mountains, generally, in the New Testament, as I pointed out, mountains are like governments. They're the head. Think the heads of your local, state, and federal governments. That's your mountains, okay? Or, established people in authority. Those are your mountains, okay? And you, firm foundations of the earth, for Jehovah will plead with his people, and with Israel he will discuss. My people, what did I do to you? So, I'm talking about the heathen who would never hear. He's talking about his people, the heathen of his people who would never hear, who would never listen to this idea that, we have Christ and we have to do what's right, follow his law, and maintain a justice system until he returns. In other words, they're being judged. The judgment on the house of Israel, as I've taught before, was 2,520 years, as some teach. I look at these things and I'm like, wow, I see how they calculate that judgment, but if it's correct, as I read before, if it was 2,520 years, and you can go back to Daniel and figure all that stuff out if you're that good, and I'm not, I've read about it, it makes some sense. If he put out the house of Israel, divorced them for a period of 2,520 years, and that period started back around 745 BC approximately, because it was years taking them into captivity. But if we go by 745 BC approximately for the house of Israel going into Assyria, you go up 2,520 years. Well, that's okay. That's approximately 1776. I think is the way they calculate it, and that makes some kind of sense. So, if he told them that's how long you're going to be spread around the earth, then he had a reason for it, and it was his reason. But still, the ones that follow Christ and do what's right, He protects them as the shield. If they call on Christ, the shield, Christ the rock, and claim Christ as their king, and they follow his law the best that they can, and they try to maintain justice the best as they can, then he protects them. So, he asks you here, how did I weary you? Answer to me, for I brought you from Egypt, from the house of bondage I freed, and Moses I sent as your leader. Well, he can only be talking about the 12 tribes there. There's no context. So there's no context to heathen just above. These people, you know, he's saying, I'll cut off your chariot drivers. Right above, from the witchcraft in your hands and all that. He's talking about his people right there. He's arguing with them. Well, you know, I brought you out from Egypt, right? And then he continues on. Other things you'll remember. And then, here's an interesting thing. Still in chapter 6, go down to verse 7, or gave my firstborn for my fault, the fruit of myself for the sin of my soul. Okay, well he's actually talking about Christ there. And that cross-references, if you notice in your cross-reference, we've already gone through a few of them, that's Matthew 9:9. There's quite a few cross-references from the New Testament that come back here to Micah. If you pay attention to that, it helps you to put also the New Testament in context. So verse 8, he has shown you, frail man, what is right, and what does the Lord seek from you? To administer justice, aright, love mercy, walk humbly with God. Isn't that what Matthew chapter 5 tells you? Yeah. Who's admitted into the kingdom of God? Those people that he mentioned there at the beginning of Matthew chapter 5. Those are the people admitted into the kingdom. Okay. Administer justice. That's repeated 1,000 times in Scripture, that you're not administering justice properly according to his law. It just says it over and over and over again, but you just don't get it. That has to come from the church, from the body of the people, is where this righteous justice system has to come from, which means that the people that administer the justice has to come from the body or the assembly, the ecclesia, which we call a church. It's fine. Call it a church. The people, the remnant, the righteous, you get the most righteous people. Those are the people you put in as judges over you. Exodus 18, or excuse me, chapter 18. He told you how to do it. There's many other verses. I got a whole book that tells you how to do it. I've mentioned it in a previous video. Alright. In the city the Lord's voice is heard, that's verse 9. And wisdom will reverence his power, or Christ. Obey him who fixes the rules. Talking about Christ. First, the whole book here. It's talking about Christ. Here you go. The rich. He's talking about the short measure. Still there. Verse 10. Well, I'll pardon the falsified scale. He's talking about people. He's talking about the banking industry and how they, that's how they take your money and create inflation so that the money you have is worth less than it was the day before, the month before. So falsified scale, that's how they do that. They simply print more money, and then the money you have is worth less. They inflate your money by various ways. That's how they steal from you. So he's talking about people, the nobles, the people in control of things, and how they just use their authority to do what they want. Or the bag full of weights that deceive. That's still verse 11. Where the rich are stuffed full of oppression, and her populous speakers of lies. Think, politicians who are in control, because they're the ones that supposedly control all these corporations who are doing the stealing and the banking and all that, who deceive with their tongue and their mouth. Okay, so verse 13. So I have inflicted disease, judgment on the house of God, right? Will waste you because of your sins. You shall eat but never be fed. Blah, blah, blah. They keep to the statutes of Gomri, and all practices Ahab's house did. Walk by the plans they destroyed. So, choose against Christ. People in control, nobles, leadership, stealing, bribe judges so they don't go to jail, blah, blah, blah. Chapter 7, woe to me, the harvest is done, the vintage all gone, there's no grapes to eat, nor ripe fig, the desire of my life. So he's talking about, offspring that would, of your children. In other words, like I said, the fig tree is a family tree. So you don't have a family tree that does what's right. In fact, all they do is take their wealth and do more oppression of the people and more thefts, and they just continue on the same crimes that you did. So your family is a family of crime family, and it just continues on and on. You never go to jail because there's no justice system, right? The gentle have wasted from the earth, so you're killing the good. Upright has seized among men. That's 7:2. And they are all plotting to murder. Each hunts for his friend with a net. Both hands are stretched out after the crime. The prince and the judge ask a bribe. So here's your leadership, your politicians, your judges, and so on and so forth. The best is a thorn, straight as a briar, verse 3. Look out for the day when your punishment comes, verse 4. So it's chapter 7, verse 4. Even now you are deeply perplexed. Trust not to a friend. For the son will dishonor his father, the mother, the daughter rebels from the mother, the bride from the mother-in-law. The foes are men of his house. Yes. So think household. Abraham had thousands of people actually in his household at one time. So people or foes are men of his house. You can also think of that as Psalms, the whole book of Psalms. That's kind of what David is saying the whole time, that other nobles and other people of Israel actually are against him. So he's talking about Jews against Christ, because we can clearly see that from the quotes to the New Testament, but this is the same context. For myself, I will watch for the Lord. So here's your remnant. I'll wait for my God of salvation. Things waiting for Christ. Okay, well, how does he know about Christ? They always knew about Christ. For if I fall down, I shall rise. For my darkness, the Lord turns to light. Okay, well, here's the context of the light coming to the Gentiles. It's Christ coming to the 12 tribes, as I've said many times. I will fear the correction of God, yes, because I've sinned against him. But if you repent, then he'll forgive you and have mercy until he examines my plea and does justice and brings me the light, which is Christ. I will wait till I feel he acquits, right? Has mercy. So the remnant who repents obtains mercy. Exactly what the second commandment in his law tells you. Follows his law. Trust on Christ. Right? My opponents will see, be covered with shame. Those who taunt me, where is Jehovah your God? In other words, where is Christ? You keep talking about him. They were talking about him. He came. Where is he? Right? Alright, so now see here she is talking about the country, I guess, countries where the Israel people live, trodden down like the dirt of the streets. But a day comes to rebuild your walls on the day the decree is revoked. So in other words, this is a judgment on the house of God is revoked. To you they will come on that day, from the district of Asher and cities of Egypt, from the border of Egypt as far as the river, which would be the Euphrates, from sea to sea and mountain to hill, though the land has been wasted, the people, the result of their crimes. Yes, this connects to Isaiah, prophecy in Isaiah, about after the end of the judgment, which is this 7-year tribulation. So at the end of the 7-year tribulation, eventually Christ will return. All these heathen people, as we were reading, and I mentioned in my previous Jews versus Gentiles in Isaiah chapter 60, it said that some of these Gentiles were non-Israelites coming back to help the Israel people after they were brought out from their captivities, and after the strong arm of the Lord basically pointed out who his people were and fought for them and shielded them and protected them, and everybody recognized who the 12 tribes were at the end time. This is the same context. house of God, as we said. This is the end of their judgment. So, guide your race by your staff, the rock you possess. So this is Christ possessing. Christ has the staff, so it's the rod of Aaron, think of it that way. And your race is the 12 tribes. Who lie lost in the forest of Carmel, who in old times pastured in Gilead and Bashan. So, 12 tribes. I will show you wonderful things, as when I brought you from the country of Egypt. Yes, there's also a mention of returning from Egypt a second time. And this is the context. The heathen shall see them and blush. All their heroes lay hand on their mouth. So, at the end time, Christ shows everyone who the 12 tribes were. So the heathen will blush because they're killing them. And their ears shall be strained. They shall lick up the dust like a snake. Like earthworms crawl out from their holes in dread of the living, your God, and in terror of you. Yes, they'll be in terror of you when they see that the remnant has Christ helping them, and all those things that were in Scripture now have been fulfilled. So this is the end time. Oh, and let's see what how Micah wraps up. What God would forgive sin like you? Yes. Pardon faults that have broke his estate. So you did it to yourself through your own faults, not following God's law, not following the things he told you to do, not having a proper justice system. You're going around the world in perpetual war, tearing into nations, waging war, saying, oh, they did this, they did that, and we got to step in here and take control and tear up your country, and then create more problems than we solve, and we just go from country to country to country, drive ourselves into trillions of dollars of debt and perpetual war, and then eventually you're judged for that. This is what's getting ready to happen. So, it's right here in Micah. Not retaining, we're in 7:18, not retaining his anger forever, for he feels it a delight to be kind, in other words, to have mercy. 19, he returns and has mercy on us. Again, context was 12 tribes, so he's having mercy on, who will our frailties subdue and cast all our faults to the depths of the sea, giving truly to Jacob the promise to Abraham, as he swore to our fathers in days long ago. Wait a minute. The promise to Abraham, what was the promise to Abraham? Christ having mercy on the 12 tribes, redeeming the 12 tribes, as he swore to our fathers in days long ago. Is that what I just read? That Christ is the promise? Yeah, I think that's what we just read. Christ was promised the son of Abraham. He gives mercy to the remnant who follow his law and stick with the message of Christ, as it says all the way to Revelation and everywhere else in between. Same context. These Christian people who live in this great nation and commonwealth of Christian nations. Great nation can only be great if it's a Christian nation, but we're not continuing to follow his law and to maintain justice and to do exactly what he told you to do, which is really a simple thing, but it has to come from your churches. You have to teach it. You have to tell people who they are, explain who the 12 tribes are. They're the people who believe in Christ, maintain justice, follow his law. No other way to look at it. And they, as you see in my cross references there in Matthew 1:1, it's right there. Prophesied all the way back from Genesis 15:1 to Abraham. Christ is that exceeding great reward. Give mercy on the children of Abraham, promised to the forefathers. It's right there in Micah. So what did we get? 2 verses into the New Testament. We've already summated the whole Bible. It's all right there in Micah. It's actually going to be in all these books that we're going to look through that's going to go through the same things. over and over and over. 12 tribes expecting Christ. The people he, the only people to get into the kingdom of God, the ones that follow his law and teach the message of Christ. And we're going to see that 12 tribes always knew about Christ. They either called him the shield, they called him the rock or the stone, or they called him the horn of salvation, the king of salvation. They called him Melchizedek, or they called him the king of righteousness, or they called him the prince of peace. You can call him whatever you want, but that's Christ. All of those things are Christ. That's the message. It's really not that difficult. Anybody could have learned that in the first couple of weeks in church, what the context was. Now, we're going to go through the whole New Testament. I'll try to keep it a little bit shorter next time, but Micah is, we're just right there at the very beginning. We had these important things to go over, and so I read the whole chapter of Micah, but we won't be doing that in each one. I expect you to read some of this stuff before and after, and we'll be going a lot faster. So, thanks for watching this one. We'll come back and do better the second time, I hope.